I thought it might be good to just ground by speaking about where you are at the moment, and
Mhm.
yeah, a little bit about the land or the place that you are living in.
Yeah. So I'm now in Massachusetts and in the Boston area.
Mm.
And I live in a neighborhood that actually, well, of course, like in before colonization, and also now, it is cared for by the Wampanoag, and Massachusetts is the home of the um, Massachusetts, Nipmuc, and Wampanoag nations. In the beginning of the 1900s, many immigrants from Italy arrived here in the neighborhood where I am now. A whole, neighborhood or a whole village in Abruzzi called Castelvetrano basically ended up moving here. And they had their meeting place up the street from where my home is, and still, like many of the homes are owned by or are, like the um, the subsequent generations, like that can still call their ancestors the immigrants that arrived from Castelvetrano are still here. So we do have some connection to place. There's an orchard next to where I live that's been there for about 100 years, with a beautiful grape uh, and grapevine, and the raccoons like to go and forage, and it's quite beautiful. And for me, like it's interesting to also see the urban structure, if you will, or the arrangement of the homes around these circular spaces that used to be the center of the farms, with all of the stables around, and basically like that's somehow like the way that the buildings are arranged up to today. So despite the fact that it is now an urban environment, but you still see the traces of an agricultural history in the neighborhood itself.
Right. Wow. Beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah,
Good to know that. And you're from Italy originally.
yeah, I
Um,
am.
yeah. And did you grow up in an urban area or a rural area?
So I grew up in an area called Maremma,
Hmm.
in a city called Grosseto in the southern tip of Tuscany.
Right.
And it is actually an area that used to be, it's still mostly like a rural, or there's natural parks, and there's long stretches of beaches, and there's um, mostly like cultivated areas, and woods and so on, with a city that has about 80,000 residents. As of now, it is a city that was founded in the medieval period, around 800 after Christ, and has since then been mostly like a rural environment. Yeah,
Yeah. So that I guess that leads to yeah, your origin story in terms of the work you are doing now, which
yeah.
is very much the intersection of culture making and agrarianism. Um,
Hmm.
and yeah, I think we'll let viewers know about your book, which we've also already had a post about, and we've read out.
Hello.
Fantastic.
Thank
And it's
you.
40 years earlier. This little book was published, and another Italian,
Mm-hmm.
and a wonderful book that really influenced Meg and I years ago. It was just it came at the right time when we were already moving in that direction. So apart from permaculture and the more pragmatics of subsistence farming, the cultural aspects, the culture making aspects have been really dear to us. So yeah,
Yeah.
what's your origin into this space as a researcher?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you are showing me the book How to Imagine by Henry Martin and Gianfranco Baruchello. You actually have the original edition, which surprises me. I couldn't find it. Oh, good for you.
Mm.
Um, and and I would say that Baruchello is part of an origin story for me as well. Um, in Baruchello, the artists that participated in the Arte Povera movement in Italy in the 60s and 70s, early 70s. Um, I am an art historian rather than an artist, and the uh, my education was certainly informed by knowledge about contemporary art in Italy, and um, so that has always been an important point of reference and understanding the various facets and interests in um, an interest developed by the artists that were part of the Italian landscape in the 60s and 70s has, been a starting point for subsequent studies that would then expand on themes and threads that were first presented, for me, within the context of Italian art, contemporary Italian art. Now, why is it relevant to talk about rural traditions within, a contemporary art context that was rooted in Italian humus? Italy really transitioned from a very rural, culture and an economy into a modern, industrial economy very suddenly in the years right after World War II. With the Marshall Plan and support from the U.S. in particular, there was this kind of economic boom that flourished, especially from the mid 50s, after the first, the funding was used for the physical reconstruction of the country, and then that ended up supporting also an industrial um, really like development. But that happened really like very, very suddenly. And so artists that were practicing in the moments of this kind of immediate and sudden shift
Mm.
were constantly rethinking about, what had been lost, right? Like about the challenges of these, transitions in nature cultures, even though they would have not used this term, back then. But they were really keenly aware of the fact that they were facing, and that they had to process, help maybe like their participants and publics to process what it meant to move from particular economy or particular culture into another that was, much more mechanized and maybe like impersonal and, less reliant on family and community and so on.
Mm.
So, that was certainly for me like the beginning, the starting point. It's great that again, like you are sharing Baruchello's book, How to Imagine, that was basically it's a product of the dialogues with the African American translator, critic, actor Henry Martin. That was a good friend of Baruchello, was based in Italy and spent extensive periods of time at Agricola Cornelia, the farm that Baruchello founded in the early 1970s. But there was just a symposium at the Accademia dei Lincei in Italy co-sponsored by the Herziana Library and the Fondazione Baruchello in Rome, that really like reconsidered the whole path of this artist, starting from the really like actually like in the period in between the wars, like, and then, into the 1970s with the experience of Agricola Cornelia. And I did present there about Baruchello. I just actually submitted the chapter for the proceedings a few days ago. So this is still like something that I think about consistently.
Hmm. It makes me also think another Italian route is the Club of Rome report and the oil crash of or the stock market crash with the limits to growth report in
Mhm,
73, 74.
mhm,
And of course, that's a global phenomenon, and permaculture came out of that, as David Holmgren
mhm,
often says.
mhm,
It was sprouted, like so many things were sprouted from this limits to growth. So it's
mhm,
really fascinating 40 years on, your book is coming at that point of the real sort of embodied or physical ramifications for limits to growth. And limits is almost a sort of taboo subject in some academic fields that, it's somehow to speak to limits is somehow problematic or create some sort of privileging of those who can and those who can't. But in terms of like real energetic limits and how we are living this sort of um, double uh, existence. We are in digital and industrially um, mechanized cultures or a civilization, and yet we are still so reliant on agriculture, although the agriculture isn't seen. It's like
mhm,
completely, almost the wealthier the country, it's almost disappeared. So that the artist then goes to the fridge to pick their food or clicks an app or goes to the supermarket to fuel their bodies to make culture. Whereas what we've very quickly lost is that nature culture or nature agricultural uh,
mhm,
uh, sort of reality. And um, so I guess my interest in this is in your book is where it stands in terms of energy. And
mhm,
we look at the concept of energy descent of David Holmgren,
mhm,
permaculture co-originator.
mhm,
We can argue where we are in the bell curve of industrial energy availability, and we can have arguments about new technologies coming on that will, give us endless amounts of energy. But I feel like in a way, the kind of warring and financial instability and cultural instability in the West is all at the moment completely determined by the invisible bogeyman, which is declining cheap energy,
mhm,
declining cheap fossil fuels. And so
mhm,
aggression and warmongering we're seeing, um, like most wars in the last century, I would say almost all have been about crude oil. And yet they're often, historically, they're usually complexes between characters and leaders. And that's how historians seem to see um, uh, to view history um, through the human character or personality or biography. Whereas actually, what underpins, I think, all human um, activity is energy. And so, and this is not my idea. This goes back to many theorists. And but but I think what's a sort of a blind spot certainly in Western in the rich countries in terms of culture making is that the fridge already operates as a depository for food, and therefore culture is unrooted from the earth, is already unrooted. It has no origin story. And when our food is originless or storyless, it completely changes the culture. And I think there's a kind of madness in that. And I feel
Mhm.
like that's part of what we're experiencing as a global culture right now. I don't know if you've got any comments to make to that, but it's a bit of a long rant, but
Yeah. Um, I'm thinking, based on the studies that I developed through artists and the practice of agriculture, I can observe that many of the artists that engage with agriculture will try to deconstruct the forms of industrial agriculture or GMOs or use of chemicals or monocultures and so on. So that's certainly a thread. The idea of using agriculture as a way of critiquing, more standardized, especially more standardized and modernist forms of agriculture that are also, the most common at this point, on a global level.
mm,
But then there is also a plethora of artists and collectives that are interested in proposing different kinds of models of, that allow to reimagine, at least like the potential or, the utopia, but an utopia that is concrete of re-engaging with the particular place, with the particular land, and trying to maybe like kind of rediscover, some of the technologies that were designed to cultivate a specific place, or to try to reconnect with the stories, right? Like, and with the names and the dialects and the languages. And so there's again, like sometimes like the coexistence, in the same practice of deconstruction and then reimagination, while there's also, sometimes artists that prefer to focus on one of these two aspects.
yeah.
But I would say that what you're talking about is certainly very central, in general, to practices of artists that have chosen farming as a form of aesthetic expression and also as a form of experience, of performance that merges art and life um, in in an opportunity to reconnect with place, but also with their own bodies, also with other than human entities, also with an understanding of a different pace and rhythm that connects their bodies with cycles of life and death,
Mm,
and that accepts the reality of decay, and even of forms of violence that are
mm,
inevitable
mm,
when one thinks about, farming, violence to the tomato, or, violence to, the plum tree, or violence to sometimes, fish and hunt, and so on and so forth, and game. Um, and it is usually a really complex, uh, experience, right? Like, because it brings back like that um, engagement with a particular place, with the techniques and technologies that humans had used historically to relate to that particular place, with the seeds that would grow in that particular place historically, or that could do well in in a more contemporary moment. This kind of reconnection with all of these complexities that are bodily fatiguing, that are fatiguing on a bodily level, physically fatiguing, um, that are intellectually, kind of complex and so on.
mm,
This is incredibly nourishing as an experience. It's also, it can be tolling, in other ways, but it tends to be very central to the process of basically artistic practice that engages with farming. So energy is a node, but also the connection or like the construction and critique of technologies that are industrial, that are maybe overusing that energy on the one hand, and then is the reappreciation of energy in terms of the sun, that might provide energy for growth, or in terms of like the energy of the body or the energy that can come from or can become visible and visualized through the witnessing of the growth of a tree and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes me think also about when the body when artists are using their body to uh, perform their practice,
Mhm.
as we are, um, it there is this inherent doing saying, to quote Joan Retallack, who's an American scholar in poetics. Um, yeah, and doing saying is just like a sort of a great term to describe um, how an the practice is embodied, or there's an embodiment in art practice that it then becomes informed by the more than human world because of the absolute need to have relationships, to be in constant rolling relationships with many forms and entities and beings and bodies.
Mhm.
Um, and I feel like as we deepened our practice, the centralized urbane art center, the center of
Mhm.
curators and galleries and museums, became less and less important. And our local community as a place to, as co-collaborative, as co-collaboration with
Mhm.
neighbors and other people moving to live more like this through permaculture or regenerative farming, became not just the audience, but the participant as well. So
Yeah.
that over the 20 years, it's become less and less about, or no kind of real interest in the museum curator um,
Mhm.
realm, and much more interested in the realm of uh, engaging with a local cohort. And in that, there's been some really beautiful uh, processes of reculturing. And for
Mhm.
example, on the weekend, we had a beautiful winter solstice ceremony that we've been crafting with community here for many years. And initially, it was just a fire in the forest, people gathering, sharing food. And little by little, it's become just a way of honoring the dark. The dark is something we recognize, many of us recognize, as something that's feared in Western, particularly Christian cosmology. And so there is this sort of invitation to engage with the dark, and the dark to some of us is the sacred feminine as well.
Mhm.
So it's like re-engaging with the sacred mother, or what we call mother country here, or our Aboriginal friends use that term,
Mhm.
mother country, and we really respond to that. So yeah, there is this sort of slow step by step. It's druidic in the sense that there is no ideology. It's not a cult forming. All it is a reverence for the earth as a giving, generative, and sometimes taking life entity
Mhm.
that is usually responded to by those of us who are coming together to just be quiet in the forest, just sometimes just listen.
Mhm.
So there isn't a kind of religious structuring, but there is, I suppose, a kind of um, an ordinary uh, reverence for
Hmm.
life that I certainly didn't have before I started this work. And in fact, I started from a very political, ideological place to
Hmm.
to deindustrialize my mind. Um, but more and more so, it's become a place of yeah, it's become much more about soul and a relationship with other souls,
Hmm.
human and much more than human. And so I guess my question is that in your research, is this a common thread with art? Yeah, I'd like to hear some
Yeah.
examples. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, you were talking about participation and community and how that informs your experience and the co-production of knowledge. And I would say, this is another origin story for me in terms of like the way what led me to choose this topic. And food-based art certainly, right, like was another kind of node that led me to look more deeply about agriculture-based art, because um, artists that started engaging with food in a more participatory way, especially starting in the late 50s, early 60s with the Fluxus movement within a European and North American, and Western, context, and calling basically eating together art, or presenting food as a form of art. In the context of these, movements and groups and ideas, the possibility of involving the public in processes of co-creation was one of the main reasons for the incorporation of food. Food is eaten, and when it's consumed, it becomes the body of the participant. And so, there's no other medium, if you will, no other, it's plenty of materials, but no other, um, yeah, form of like a art that will allow for that, kind of sharing and participation and involvement of the viewer, at the same level. So artists that were interested in contrasting the institution of art, that was supposed to create a distance between the author or the artwork on the pedestal and the viewer and the observer. The artists that were interested in critiquing and pushing against that hierarchy ended up incorporating food. And so, participatory strategies were really like at the core of food-based art, based on my definition of the term, and the definition that myself and Margherita Dalla Valva, a frequent collaborator of mine, ended up crafting a few years ago for another book titled The Taste of Art that we wrote together. So again, like this idea of like participation is very central to food-based art, and food-based art incorporates aspects of really like gardening, edible plants, and gardening as like a form of again of artistic expression and production. So that's like an aspect. And then another aspect that of religion and spirituality, I think that can also be addressed in a multifaceted way. Certainly, again, like in this moment of reconsideration of the definition of art that was the 50s and the 60s, and into the 70s, even 80s, artists like Joseph Beuys really like uh, were among the founders of the idea that agriculture and farming could be forms of artistic expression. And he really saw agriculture as a vehicle to, first of all, rethink think economies, that is, beyond the dichotomies that existed in the time in which he practiced in the Cold War moment between a Soviet model of economy and a capitalist model of economies.
Mhm.
That for him, but he didn't really like align with either, and he proposed a third way, through his work that was based on reconnecting with the land, and really like producing, or kind of yeah, like creating work that was an expression of the self through the relationship with the soil, and the possibility of growing food, and through barter, right? Like create economies that would be revaluing, not I mean, valuing art and creativity and food production as a form of capital rather than money. So he was certainly like very much like politically minded, and tried to describe, perhaps we could call it an ideology or a philosophy or an aesthetics, but that would go beyond the ideological positions that were dominant at his time. And he was very interested in the ways that this reconnection with the soil and with the ground and with food
Mm.
could, I mean, he had experienced it, and he knew that this could really generate forms of new spiritualities. And so, that I think is certainly like an important point of reference when we think about agriculture as a vehicle, right? Like when done in a way that is not prioritizing efficiency or, again, industrial production or, markets, which is not easy to do because it's also like really hard to have the knowledges and the experience to not think about that, not use standardized methods, but, to experiment, that is also in some ways a privilege because it means that one has again, like the mindset, the community, access to land, the time, and and the infrastructure to really embark on a project like this. But if agriculture is done in this way, it can certainly lead to um, a rerouting to shoot up and elevate, the spirit, and the mind. So that was one of the main messages for Boyce, that was also interested in energy, among other things. But
Mm.
again, like the energy that can be achieved through these processes, and that can be gifted by lemons, or that can be gifted by fruits, and so on and so forth. And then Boyce is just one, but it is a pattern in the work of artists that engage with agriculture to touch on the idea of spirituality, and religion. And there's a book, I just gave a talk about commoning, and the ways that artists that work with agriculture, often mention the idea of commoning and the commons. I gave this talk in Germany, in Halle, Saale, because there is an exhibition going on right now, titled Planetary Peasants. And then I was invited it's in the contemporary art exhibit, and I was invited to give a talk as part of the programming linked to the exhibit. And it is an exhibit that is meant to honor the German Peasants' War,
Mhm.
that in 1525 basically gathered peasants in a moment of transition from feudal economies to capitalist economies to reclaim some of their rights. But a recent book actually just came out, titled Summer of Fire and Blood by Lyndall Roper, that I have here, points out, proposes a really new interpretation of, these complex phenomenon that was the German Peasants' War, by arguing that the those that participated in these efforts to reorganize labor and to reorganize hierarchies, within, the social structures of this, very delicate moment and prolonged and complex moment of the transition from feudalism to capitalism in Germany. Basically like one of the elements that pushed them really like to embark in these, kind of movements for change was that of spirituality. Even, at that moment, it was a matter of maybe rethinking the structure of power, but then, the Christian church, and to think of ways that would be much more that would honor, in more prominent ways the relationship with nature, or like the possibility of expressing spiritual forms of spirituality from below and commoning and so on. But the argument is that really like a reimagination of spirituality and what that could be in relationship with nature, with non-human animals, with plants and so on, was really like the one of the forces behind the German Peasants' War. So I'm saying this because it seems like these are not thoughts that are just emerging, right? Like it seems like peasants and farmers and people that engage with the land have considered these aspects of spirituality, creativity, forms of more horizontal economies and so on, like over centuries, and that we're just basically um, um, re-experiencing some of the drives that our ancestors, had really felt, even in a European context, and of course, even more so, in indigenous communities that have been able to maintain a much more reciprocal relationship with the land, up to contemporary times.
Yeah, two texts that have been really important to Meg and I here, um, in historical texts, in this transition, from feudalism to capitalism, is Michael Perelman's The Invention of Capitalism,
Mhm.
in which he details many of the historical records to kind of disclaim the early capitalists' uh, ideology that capitalism is a natural economy, and just how it took centuries and centuries to corral and force and push and create policies to sever land bonded peoples, peasant peoples, particularly in the UK, but throughout Europe, from access to land, and of course the enclosures, and then the clearances in the UK and Scotland. Um, so in terms of like how we see particularly men men's roles or men's work in the household and community economies in a feudal peasant scenario, to being the first exiled from home economy making subsistence economy and put into the mines and put into the factories of industrializing Europe. And so the severance of men's work, the severance from land, that of men's work has been a real interest of ours in terms of thinking through about what is problematic in the culture now, and how do we want to address that in our own household as parents, as community actors, as home school facilitators of a forest school. Um, and the other important book is Caliban and the Witch, which you probably know well.
Yeah.
And yeah, again, the historical records of Silvia Federici, in terms of the feminine story of that transition, how feminine power was deconstructed, smashed really through church and state policies in the witch hunts. And so
Mhm.
those traumas of both men and women being um, uh, shepherded in the most sort of manipulated or massaged or shepherded in the best sense, or like brutally and violently severed from um, land bonded economies has
Mhm.
been a real interest in us to explore. And
Mhm.
I think because we see the global, particularly global Western civilization, as still living the trauma of that and
Mhm.
of those stories, generational stories. And I think of my grandmother, both my grandmothers actually, who were rural working poor in Australia. Um, Many Irish ancestors came as convicts to Australia. Some ancestors came as so-called free settlers. And so, yeah, just the colonial heritages of my ancestors then becoming the colonists in other lands, in further afield lands like Australia and America and Canada, etc. So, in terms of like moving past a sort of a settler guilt in terms of what the trauma we have brought to this country, um, our our kind of process of culture making has reconnected with our first people ancestry, while at the same time connected with the first people cosmology and friends that we have here. And so
Mhm.
rather than seeing ourselves as alien to being people who I th yeah, phrase it a different way. I think ultimately the damage of colonization that still takes place in a country like Australia is because we don't understand the damage in ourselves as settlers, as second
Mhm.
peoples, through those violent uh, kind of erasures of land bondedness that happened to us, if we are from Europe, that is. And of course, Australia is a very multicultural country now, so it's not just that one story, but there's many dispossession stories of people who arrive in Australia. There, many cultures share dispossession and colonization as a main thrust. So I guess what I wanted to ask in that is if colonization is such a big force in the kind of cultural psyche of artists, what are some of the responses to that that have gone beyond settler guilt and into something more generative?
Yeah. It's a tough question for sure. And I would say when there's a whole chapter of my book that is dedicated to colonial legacies, and I think that um, there are many examples of artists that have been proactively re traced some of these histories, complicating them, and also kind of used that have used art as a way of processing, of bringing people together, of providing, opportunities for dialogue, while at the same time, or even for sharing, right? Like, but at the same time, avoiding um, to forget, what are these traces that still have, such important impact on the the society of today, especially in some places that have been more heavily affected by colonization. So, some examples that come to mind include, the practice of my wonderful dear friend, Maria Magdalena Campos Pons, that is an artist from Cuba that is now based in the US. I met Magda when she was teaching at the SMFA at Tufts, the school where I teach. And I was, a junior faculty member, and she had been there for many, many years. And so, the relationship with her was initially, that of a mentor and mentee, or we were, basically like colleagues, but also, interested in listening to each other. And Magda's origin stories are multiple. Her ancestors were Yoruba, brought into Cuba through enslavement, unfortunately, across the Middle Passage to work in plantations, sugar plantations, and then also Chinese. In Cuba there was an important presence of Chinese indentured workers that were not enslaved, but that came into the island, basically forced to repay the ticket, or like the price of their journey through their own labor. And so Magda's experience, or family, roots basically combined, these two stories. And then she herself, and her work is about reconstructing the memories and reevoking the memories of her family stories, and the multiplicity of those really like threads. And then she herself, moved to study in the US, and then at some point couldn't go back because of political relationship between, the US and Cuba. And so this idea of memory, right? Like, and understanding the legacies of, the violence of colonial agriculture, with plantation histories, but also the connection that water, provided, that memory provided, that identity provided, that storytelling provided, that materials provided, were all really prominent in, are still all very prominent in her work. And she's incredibly interested in, even, now, um, orchestrating performances and installations that involve food, both edible gardening in general, and then, the sharing of meals, but also dance and music and voice and so on, as ways of bringing people together from all paths, right? Like to remember, to wonder, to be close, right? Like she talks about radical love. So I think that this is certainly an incredible model, right? Like for that it is an invite to perhaps like go beyond, this idea of white guilt that, for me, coming from a Catholic country, is also even more problematic, this idea of guilt, because it was so forced on me, since I was a child, that at some point, an intellectual and emotional liberation came through this, kind of letting go of guilt as an experience, to try to really like engage with the world in a way that seemed to be maybe more sincere, or curious, or maybe like generous, because guilt is something that makes you think about yourself a lot, right? Like rather than listening to what others, might be experiencing or doing with in a generous way, like you end up really like always keeping in mind yourself and the things that you might carry with you that you might have inherited, and that you cannot let go of. So
This is the dance,
yeah,
I think, between
yeah.
um, honoring the past in ourselves, and because in some way, whether we're the colonizer or the colonized or both, in,
Both.
yeah,
Oftentimes it's both.
yeah, we carry the wound of both those stories, and so a lack of consciousness to the wound is it creates more wounds, but then only living in the wound also creates problems as well. And so, I mean, an example of that locally, Meg and I hosted for many years what we call the Terra Nullius breakfast, where the town, outside our town hall, we'd put up a large banner saying Terra Nullius, the Latin meaning empty land, which was the British legal term, Latin legal term that was applied to Australia. No one here when at the point of colonization. And so by this was on the what is called the National Day or the Australia Day. We would put this banner up and then just simply get a whole bunch of us would gather and we'd breakfast. And it was in response to this sort of what we saw as unconscious celebration and a standing upon another whole culture, particularly the Jarrah culture on this particular land, but Aboriginal cultures all around Australia. And so there's been a lot of debate and a lot of discussion about this because the day itself is pretty much the flag planting day of the First Fleet. So, you know, there's a lot of conversation in Australia for many years about the insensitivity of this, and there's a movement to change the date. But so we would invite an emerging elder, Beck Phillips, who's a Jarrah woman and storyteller and mother, and to come and speak at this event. And the last time we did it a few years ago, Beck said to us, "I reckon it's time we moved into the healing phase now." And so, which was such a beautiful invitation for us to move beyond the politic and into something deeper. And so, but those several years of actually marking that for this community, marking that particular historical violence, really, of those two Latin words it was really important for us to get to the level of relationship with Beck and also Uncle Rick Nelson, who is another Jarrah elder who is um, really inviting a time of healing and a coming together. So,
Mm,
because of that eldership in this particular part of Indigenous Australia, the invitation comes from First People soul in order for us to move beyond settler guilt wound, but not to forget it, not to like, because there's productive guilt and productive shame and unproductive guilt and shame. And
mhm,
so it's it, I think it's like each of us maybe there's an invitation for each of us to understand is our shame or guilt productive? Is it generative? Is it moving towards something that is life-giving and life-affirming and life-making as opposed to keeping us or yeah, us as an individual or as a society or as a group or a community in a state of political agitation.
mhm,
So that's why I say it's a dance because I'm not shy of um, the political, particularly in this time. My last chapter in my doctorate, Walking for Food, was it was like a critique of writing as a civil instrument of ecological disembodiment, and
mhm,
it was like a real exploration after years and years of writing and being a writer of is this another instrument of ecological estrangement? Is are truly ecologically intelligent cultures necessarily oral cultures. And so that was sort of how I finished my doctorate. And I feel like in many respects, the only thing I can arrive at why I still write is that because we are living in a time that is highly political. And even though that doesn't inframe my whole day, it's the generative, the relational that is much more important. Writing is, particularly for those who do not have privilege, writing is a possibility for political to be viewed and to be heard. So it's not like a yes or no about that, but it for me, I think oral and this is why I'm really enjoying having these conversations because of what happens when two people speak or a group of people speak together.
Mhm.
Things are so like there's a beauty and a poetic in this sort of cross-pollination.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the importance of relationships and reciprocity, and I think that that is really like um, the main node, right? Like the main point that we need to keep in mind when we think about healing and when we think about going beyond guilt and so on and so forth. I think it's hard to generalize to offer like a recipe that will work for everybody. I think that this is a process that is intimate, and that happens at the inner level of each individual, considers that it has the courage to consider the implications of these wounds. um, but it is also about the ability to dedicate time to forming relationships with individuals or with communities, right? Like that are also um, enduring, that are not going to be um, ephemeral or really like temporary or maybe like um, occasional, right? Like, and so I think that the connections that you've been nurturing with the Jaja elders are really like exemplary from what I understand, based on what you're sharing here with me, because they have continuity in time, because you do share place, you do share, you have an opportunity to share stories, right? Like that, and then there's a will, to come together and to heal, because there's a desire to actually connect and bond and, be together, oh, on a place, on a site and like with community and so on. I think that that is harder to achieve in general terms, right? I can say, okay, like it's not okay to feel guilty, and so I'm not no longer gonna feel guilty, and then I'm just gonna move on and do whatever I've been doing, and that's also complicated and problematic. But I think that if there's something that I've come to appreciate through the study of agriculture-based practices, artistic practices, is the ways that artists that engage with farming tend to really understand the specificity of being on a particular place, engaging with the histories of that place, with the communities of the place, with the maybe the wounds that the earth still carries, and there's specificity to that, right? Like these practices are really rooted into specific places, and move beyond the idea of standardizing even models of behavior or standardizing solutions, right? Like that can be applied to any kind of scenario. So I think that this reality of colonialism's harsh histories of occupation and dispossession and so on, right? Like there's no way to question this, right? Like some might argue that this is like inevitable. Some might argue that it's always been like that. It's part of human nature. And others are, horrified by, by these mechanisms and dynamics, but they have occurred, that there's no question that they have occurred, right? Like they're part of a global history. And so the ways that people individually or as communities relate to these, I think that need to be like personal and communal journeys, but that are specific. I don't think that I can offer any cookie cutter solution. And it's certainly something that I've been able to appreciate about this and other issues about artistic practices that are based on farming, that they are not standardized and they're not monocultural, right? Like they're not industrial. They are different. Each and every one of these practices is different, and that's the biodiversity and the cultural diversity, right? Like that goes beyond the monoculture of the mind. I know that Vandana Shiva is another author that you really refer to very often, and that's, I would say, like the takeaway for me, from this study that is ongoing. The book is really almost like a starting point for a continuous, re-engagement with these topics for me.
Mm. This has just been such a wonderful conversation. Um, thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Is there anything else that you'd like to leave with before we part ways?
Yeah, just expressing my gratefulness for the opportunity to really like enjoy a conversation with you and to learn about what you do and Mag and artists as family, as a collective.